Hi everyone, I'm the warm-up act for Bradley. So what we're going to talk about today is significant event and clinical audit. But what we really wanted to do was to make this session really practical. So we actually look at a case, look at what's happened and follow it right through from a significant event audit through to a clinical audit. So I think this quote that's up on the screen now is really important. To err is human, to cover up is unforgivable, and to fail to learn is inexcusable. We all make mistakes in veterinary practice. We all have things that don't go as well as they should. And I think what we need to do is have a structure where we learn from those things and make it much less likely that that same mistake will happen again. Obviously, new mistakes can happen, but let's at least cut down the possibility of making the same mistake over and over. So that's the theme, really, of the whole thing. And significant event audit is something that they've been using quite a lot in general practice, in human general practice, as part of their revalidation process for GPs. And basically, a significant event is anything which impacts on the care of the patients, the animals, or the conduct of the practice. It doesn't have to be a critical incident. It doesn't have to be something major. It's just anything that impacts on care. It is a form of audit. It's not quantitative like the clinical audit that Bradley's going to talk about. It's more of a qualitative form of audit, but it does need some sort of framework to be doing this properly in your practices. There we go. So what are the significant events that might happen in practice? Well, we all know those awful heart-sinking moments, don't we, where an animal dies under anaesthetic. So obviously that is a very, very significant event and a critical incident, really. But there's a lot of other things which are less serious, but still have a big impact. Things like dispensing errors, and they can be extremely serious, like the cat that gets the 50 mgs or even 150 mgs of the enrofloxacin instead of the 15 mgs and finishes up not being able to see. All sorts of dispensing errors that can happen. Things like lab results or lab samples that go astray and never actually get to the lab. Lab samples that do get to the lab, but the reports never get back to the owners. Euthanasia, there's endless possibilities, isn't there, for what can go wrong with euthanasia, from the process itself not going that well through to the ultimate problem of the wrong ashes, the wrong cremation. So they wanted private cremation, but somebody didn't request that. All these things are significant events that can be learnt from. Things like that are not clinical, like sending out booster reminders for the pet that you put to sleep last week. These kind of things, nothing worse to actually upset clients than those sort of things happening. Things, if you get complaints, one of those awful things that happens to us sometimes, we get complaints, either just internal complaints or even complaints to the college. And this is all about taking those things that are negative and trying to make a positive from it and trying to improve animal care and client experience. And the other thing which is really good to use is near misses. And especially, like we mentioned dispensing errors before, keep a record of dispensing errors, but also keep a record in the dispensary of near misses, of the things that people find just before they go to the client, where there's a factor of 10 wrong in the calculation because somebody used their mobile phone to do the calculation and didn't quite get it right. Or, like I said before, the wrong size of tablets. So if we can learn from near misses, that's even better, because the bad thing doesn't happen. So why I think significant event audit is such a good way to get practices engaged with clinical governance generally is because it can involve everybody. Now, I'm down on the list as a small animal locum, and I certainly am a small animal locum, but I also work at the moment for the college in practice standards. So we go out and talk to people about clinical governance and how to get practices motivated. And I think this is a way that practices that are not doing much along those lines can start to get involved in the process, and it can lead to all sorts of other things. So you can involve the whole team, and a couple of my practices where I locum have been having these meetings, and I've been really surprised actually that we have involved the whole team, and some of the best comments and suggestions that we've had in some of these slightly less clinical scenarios have been from, very junior nursing assistants or from receptionists. So definitely involve the nurses. I think this is something that nurses can really take hold of and run with in a practice. So it's not just the vets, try and involve the whole team. And the whole team can learn from what the practice is good at, but also from any weaknesses, and try and put practical solutions in place. So it can improve communication, definitely. It can improve teamwork, and I think if you do take a negative incident and make it into a positive, it can improve the whole practice morale, because everyone can see you're trying to pull together to improve care. So what are significant events? Well, we showed that list before. As I said, anything that seems significant to the practice, keep a log. So you do need to record it. We don't want to be too bureaucratic, but you do need to record it. Think about the consequences of what happened, or even in some cases, what potentially could have happened. Like the dog that almost, talking about near misses, the dog that almost escapes. You can think of the potential consequences as well as the actual. Or the dog that did escape, you can think of the potential consequences if it had run across the main road, if you hadn't managed to catch it just before. Write a timeline of the event, look at the evidence. So look at the clinical records, talk to everybody involved. Look at consent forms, estimates, because often those things are involved, and let's say get the accounts of the individual. So that's the first thing to do is as soon as possible after the significant event has occurred, collect all the information. Then have the meeting. Now it's really important, this meeting is not about trying to blame somebody or apportion blame or be negative in any way. We want this to be open and fair and honest, so everybody feels that they can actually discuss this without having any sort of intimidation, feeling negative about it. So it should be very positive. And I think that actually in the past, as a profession, we've maybe have not wanted to admit to our mistakes sometimes. There has been a little bit of a, dare I say it, macho culture of not admitting that we're fallible. And I think it's better for our mental health that we can discuss these things and actually try and learn from them. So at the meeting, analyse what happened, why it happened, and sometimes why it happened is absolutely obvious. It happened because the sample didn't get sent away to the lab. You think it's absolutely obvious because the nurse forgot. But actually, there's lots of underlying reasons to that. There's no system in place. The nurse is trying to do 5 things at once. There's all sorts of underlying reasons. So don't just look for a main and obvious reason. Look for the underlying reasons. Look at what you've learnt by considering that and what needs to be changed. So you need to keep some record of the meeting and some action points because you need to be able to follow it up. So you may want to go away as a result of what's discussed and look at the evidence base and make changes. Either write a practice protocol if you haven't got one, or make changes to a practice protocol as a result of the meeting. Look if you need some CPD or general team training as a result of the meeting. Think about the timescale. So you're going to have the CPD within the next 6 months or whatever, and review it at future meetings. So we're going to hand over to Bradley now because my time is up.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Pam and to Duncan for a big build-up. Or what better sort of warm-up act can you hope for? Although actually thinking about it, I suppose you want a really poor warm-up act, don't you? So that actually you appear good by comparison. So I apologise in advance for not living up to expectations. In fact, clinical audit is a subject that I normally spend at least half a day or perhaps a day as a seminar going through. So this really is going to be a whistle-top tour through. Forget it. You know what I mean. Through the subject. So clinical audit at its simplest is just the measurement of data and clinical outcomes. Why would you want to do that? Sorry, speak up.
To see the trend.
To see a trend, okay.
Drive improvement.
To drive improvement, okay. That's a very good point. So if you're just measuring something statically, one could argue that it's perhaps not going to be very useful in terms of driving improvement. So what I'm particularly interested in is the clinical audit cycle, and that's really what I'm going to concentrate on today, which is a cycle of continual improvement. So I'm going to skim over some of these steps quite quickly in terms of preparing for the audit. We could talk about data recall and that sort of thing, and selecting what you audit. I think that's very relevant when we were talking earlier about the speaker earlier, Professor Porter, about an overabundance of guidelines. We really need to be quite selective about the areas we look at and choose those areas that we really think are going to make a difference to the way that we practice. But I do want to just spend a little time talking about guidelines, because this cycle of improvement does depend upon establishing some guidelines and then embedding them and using this audit cycle as a tool for change. And I think one message I'd like to get across, first of all, one of the really important take-home messages is the difference between clinical research and clinical audit. So, what do you think clinical research is for? What's the purpose of clinical research? Sorry? To create evidence. Yeah, that's good. What's the purpose of clinical audit? Sorry? To bring about change. Yes, I think that's true. I think the easiest way to think about it, and it is an important distinction, is because vets that embark on clinical audit tend to try and do a bit of clinical research, and that can be it can lead you up a blind alley, because there's all sorts of repercussions in terms of reproducibility that actually aren't relevant to clinical audit. So clinical research is about establishing best practice. Okay, clinical audit is about embedding best practice into the workplace. So it's a tool that you use to embed best practice into the workplace. And in order to establish what best practice is, you need to draw up clinical guidelines. Or after the talk this morning, I almost thought that should be guidance rather than guidelines, because when I heard that it costs nice £750,000 to develop national clinical guidelines, it made me realise that we really mustn't be too ambitious in what we're talking about within the veterinary profession. And I also think that there is an issue of semantics. The term protocol was used a lot. I think there is a difference between a protocol and a guideline. I don't know if I'm alone in that. What do you think the difference might be?
And protocol's very established. It's a sort of black and white.
Yeah.
Guidelines allow your clinical judgment to a certain extent.
Yeah, and I think that is more than semantics. I think there are things that you have to have protocols for. So, have you switched on the oxygen before you start anaesthetising an animal? That's a protocol. But in terms of how you direct your clinical practice, I think it is important that they are there as guidelines. It's important that clinicians see them as something that is actually there to assist them, rather than something that just narrows down their options. And in my experience, clinicians then find them to be a very positive addition to their practice. So, they're based on a systematic review of the literature. They represent a consensus. There was some talk about that earlier on, and it's in a summarised form of a series of bullet points. Certainly important that it's easy to assimilate. So what's the value of clinical guidelines? Why should we have them? Why bother? Go on, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'll settle for 3.
Avoid people making the same mistake.
Okay, avoiding people making the same mistakes. Yeah, kind of, yes. It's a good one. I had to check, see whether it's there.
Implementation of best practice principles.
Okay, yeah. Embedding best practice into what you do, certainly.
Consistency across the...
Yeah, consistency, because even if what 2 vets are doing is actually both doing fine, if one client has one experience then another, then they may get a negative impression from that.
Minimising adverse outcomes is what matters.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Anything else?
Staff training.
Yeah, helping the training, helping to keep the Royal College happy as well.
Improved animal health.
So let's see what we've got. That's Whoop, I've gone past it, sorry. No, it's not come up. Okay, I've got, they can assist the application of evidence-based practice to individual patients, a uniform standard of care, they can be used for education and training, they can be helped to make informed decisions, improving communication and managing expectations, and they can actually incorporate a cost-benefit analysis of diagnostic and treatment options. But there are issues with guidelines, and I think there was some discussion about that earlier, that clinicians need to feel that they own them, that they're not just something that's imposed upon them as a form of bureaucracy. And certainly we don't have, in most instances, any national guidelines. That's not 100% true. There is some stuff produced by ICAT Care, there's some stuff produced by BSAVA, but in a lot of the clinical work that we do, we don't have any guidelines, but that doesn't stop us from producing local guidance. And within a workplace, within a business, within an individual practice, and that needs to be, as I say, something that is relevant to best practice within that environment, something that the whole team buys into. And of course, I don't need to tell you what EBVM is, because that's why we're here today. But this is where EBVM and clinical audit are really closely linked together, because EBVM, it's no use just developing guidelines if they're not based on the best available evidence. Okay, so the next step, and a very practical one in the clinical audit process, is to actually select the criteria, or possibly single criterion, that you're actually going to use to measure performance. And it's really important to get that right, because if you don't define that properly right at the outset, you're not going to end up with the sort of outcomes that you're looking for, and then use that to actually measure your performance. And we can help to remember the selection of criteria in that they need to be distinct. They need to be relevant to what you're actually looking to improve. So it's no good measuring something that actually is irrelevant. They should be evidence-based, again. They need to be achievable, realistic, and really important here, and something I'm going to ask you to put your brains and think about with this in context this particular example that we're talking about now, is that they need to be measurable. They need to be quantitative. And basically you can measure two things. You can measure processes, or you can measure outcomes. So, for example, if for example, we take renal disease in cats, you could measure the processes that you're following in order to measure renal disease effectively, or you could set some targets for outcomes of patients that are diagnosed with renal disease, and then look at the outcomes that you're achieving, with maybe a reduction in creatinine or BUN levels or whatever you decided was appropriate in that particular instance based on the evidence, and measure those outcomes. So it didn't really matter what processes you were following, so long as you got to the right place in the end. Or you might combine the two. You might look at your outcomes, audit those first of all, decide whether you're getting reasonable performance or not. If you're not, think about why you're not and what your processes are. Make changes to your processes by putting guidelines in place, and then actually auditing the processes to see whether you're following them. And then, I say finally, but it's not really final, because this is a cycle of improvement. It's a positive feedback loop of continual improvement. You need to assess the outcome, you need to sit down, with your audit team, you need to look at the results that you've got. You need to assess the outcome, look at what improvement you've gained in performance, and consider whether that's job done, or what's more likely is that you need an ongoing process of monitoring and continual improvement to get things better and better. And in order to do that, you'll need to establish some targets. And again, on the human side, in many areas there are national targets that you can look at. to compare performance against. On the veterinary side at the moment, we have very few of those. So you'll be deciding within the context of your own work as to what a reasonable target is, and then looking for an improvement, perhaps doing a retrospective audit when you start, and then one after you've put the changes into place, and assess what changes you've been able to achieve. Because it's all about achieving change. That really is the crux of it.